June 6, 1944, for 45 a.m., Normandy coast horizon was no longer the sea, it was movement, a dark, endless wall shifting beneath the pale dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Franz Gockel, posted above the sands near Vierville-sur-Mer, lifted his binoculars and froze beyond the mist. Hundreds of silhouettes crowded the channel, battleships, cruisers, landing craft, each one outlined by flashes of gunfire. The thunder rolled seconds later, shaking the concrete of the bunker to the north. The sky was a slow river of aircraft to the south. Surf broke against iron obstacles laid across the beaches, Rommel's so-called Atlantic Wall. Yet against this armada, the wall seemed like a line of matchsticks before a tide. Gockel could barely distinguish where the sea ended and the invasion began. He shouted to his men to stand ready. But some were silent, transfixed. One whispered a single word, unglitch. Impossible. Minutes later, the first shells landed, the bunker lights flickered, the German officer steadied himself, realization cutting through the roar. This was not a raid, it was an empire arriving, and with that sight, many along the coast understood, perhaps before Berlin did, that Hitler's war had reached the point of no return. The vision that met German eyes on the morning of June 6, 1944, was not spontaneous chaos, it was the result of nearly 2 years of calculated design, a logistical and industrial effort unprecedented in the history of warfare. The Allies had named it Operation Overlord. Its opening phase, the Normandy landings, was meant to tear open Hitler's fortress from the west. By early 1944, southern England had transformed into a giant armed harbor. Roads were lined with tanks wrapped in camouflage netting. Entire villages became supply depots. Engineers paved endless marshalling yards, coated sausages on Allied maps, where convoys waited for their sequence in the greatest movement of man and material ever attempted. In total, over 15 million troops gathered in Britain, British, American, Canadian, Polish, Free French, and others, all waiting for a single order from late May. Air reconnaissance photos showed the scale of preparation, long rows of landing craft, the vast armada assembling along the Solent and the southern coast. The Royal Navy coordinated more than 6,000 vessels, from battleships and destroyers to tiny landing craft, carrying soldiers barely out of their teens. The skies would be covered by 11,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, forming a shield against the Luftwaffe that never truly appeared. But Overlord was more than muscle, it was deception. Before the invasion, the Allies launched Operation Fortitude, a sophisticated illusion designed to convince the Germans that the landings would strike not Normandy, but the Pas-de-Calais. Fake armies were stationed across Kent under General Patton, complete with inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft visible to German aerial reconnaissance. Radio traffic and double agents confirmed the ruse. Even in the early hours of June 6th, German intelligence still expected the real blow to fall at Calais. German command structure along the French coast was paralyzed by this confusion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, believed the main invasion force would strike elsewhere and wanted to keep panzer reserves inland. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, however, argued that Allied air power made inland counterattacks impossible. The enemy had to be stopped on the beaches or not at all. But Rommel was away in Germany on June 6th, visiting his wife for her birthday. German fortifications, known as the Atlantic Wall, stretched from Norway to the Spanish frontier to 2,600 kilometers of bunkers, mines, and artillery positions. Yet the strength of this wall was deceptive. Most of it was unmanned, incomplete, or lightly defended only in critical sectors. Had Rommel poured concrete and steel into strong points bristling with guns, the beaches of Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword were considered secondary. The Allies exploited that judgment. Their naval bombardment plan aimed to cripple German batteries. Within minutes of landing, dozens of destroyers and cruisers opened fire at dawn, their shells screaming overhead. The noise was a steady physical force. Veterans later said it vibrated through their bones from the cliffs above Omaha. Officers like Gockel watched this mechanical storm unfold. Reports arrived that radar operators had lost contact with the incoming waves. The sheer number of ships overwhelmed their screens to the south. Allied paratroopers were already descending behind the lines, cutting roads and bridges, isolating the coastal defenders. German 7th Army headquarters at Le Mans was slow to respond. Messages were contradictory. Many commanders assumed the attack was still a diversion. Hitler had ordered that armored divisions could not move without his personal approval, and the Führer was asleep. No one dared wake him. Before dawn by the time he was informed, the sea off Normandy was a solid field of steel, and through that wall of smoke and thunder, the first assault waves began to row toward the beaches, unaware that their approach marked the hinge of the war in Europe. The tide of history was now measurable in meters and minutes, while the Allied build-up across the Channel unfolded with industrial precision. The German side was drifting toward paralysis. Hitler's empire, by mid-1944, stood on a brittle foundation. The Eastern Front consumed divisions by the hundreds. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, its fuel reserves strangled by Allied bombing campaigns. The Kriegsmarine, once feared, was largely confined to its harbors. Its U-boats hunted relentlessly in the Atlantic. Berlin's propaganda insisted the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. Posters across occupied France declared, "We're Wharton off Yucca. We're waiting for you." Rommel knew better when he toured the French coast in late 1943. He found bunkers unfinished, mines unlaid, artillery poorly sighted. He ordered millions of additional mines and obstacles. But time and materials were scarce. Many of the men defending those beaches were not hardened veterans, but Ost battalions, conscripts from the Soviet front, prisoners of war forced into German service. Rommel pushed his engineers to strengthen coastal defenses through the winter and spring of 1944. He introduced angled steel obstacles nicknamed Rommel's asparagus to damage landing craft and gliders. He demanded concrete fortifications be reinforced with anti-tank guns and overlapping machine gun fire zones, but he could not overcome the structural flaws of German command. Fragmented authority, conflicting doctrines, and a supreme leader detached from military reality. Command chain was split between Ob West under Rundstedt and Army Group B under Rommel. The Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine operated under separate commands. Often withholding information. Communications were cumbersome, dependent on teletypes and couriers, easily disrupted by Allied air strikes. When Rommel pleaded for more tanks near the coast, Berlin refused. Armored divisions were held inland under Hitler's direct control, reserved for the true invasion still expected at Calais. Meanwhile, Allied deception continued to feed that illusion. Reports from double agents confirmed massive troop concentrations opposite the Pas-de-Calais. False radio chatter indicated invasion timetables for July, not early June, even as radar stations along the Normandy coast picked up vast naval signatures. Many German officers dismissed them as a feint, perhaps a diversion for the main blow to come later. On the evening of June 5th, a severe storm swept across the Channel. High winds and rough seas convinced many on both sides that an invasion was impossible. Rommel himself returned to Germany, confident no major operation would launch in such weather. His absence would prove decisive. At 3 o'clock on June 6th, the first reports arrived: unidentified aircraft over the Cotentin Peninsula, parachute drops behind the lines. Local commanders requested permission to release reserve units, but bureaucracy stalled them. The German 7th Army believed these drops were small commando raids. By 4 o'clock, radar stations at Cherbourg and Le Havre began to register what looked like a solid wall of returns, too dense for a single fleet. Still, disbelief lingered. The scale defied imagination. No German officer had ever seen an armada of that magnitude. The Channel, once a defensive moat for the Reich, had transformed into an avenue of invasion. Observers reported seeing lines of ships stretching from horizon to horizon, more than 7,000 vessels, from small landing barges to floating artillery platforms. The air above them roared with thousands of Allied planes escorting the convoys. Messages raced through the chain of command. Massive naval movement off Normandy coast beaches under bombardment. Request immediate orders, but there were no clear orders. Rundstedt's headquarters, overwhelmed by conflicting intelligence, hesitated only when the first waves of troops began landing on Utah and Omaha. Did reality finally crush the illusion beyond? The German coastal batteries at Point du Hoc and Longues-sur-Mer were firing blindly into fog and smoke. Communication lines were shredded by naval bombardment officers like Gockel, trapped inside concrete bunkers, could only report what they saw, the unstoppable procession of Allied power. The culmination of every misjudgment made since 1940, the Reich had built its walls on deception and fear now. Both were breaking apart under the weight of truth. The sea outside was no longer a frontier. It was judgment arriving in waves in every war. There comes a moment when belief falters, when a soldier understands that duty and destiny are no longer aligned for many German officers along the Norman coast. That moment arrived at dawn on June 6, 1940 for Lieutenant Colonel Franz Gockel, Oberleutnant Heinrich Severloh at WN62. Captain Walter Omsen at Longues-sur-Mer. Names scattered through after-action reports all described the same thing, an ocean of steel. A sight so immense it silenced argument for years. The German officer corps had been trained in certainty, the belief in tactical genius, the invincibility of German arms, the obedience to firm orders, but what they witnessed that morning shattered that foundation through binoculars. They saw destroyers lined in perfect intervals, warships pounding the coastline with mechanical precision, landing craft crawling forward like insects against the surf. The scale was beyond comprehension. Any officers did not panic. They followed procedure. Range data was logged, fire orders issued, targets calculated, but underneath the discipline ran an undercurrent of disbelief. Some later wrote that the thunder of guns made them feel physically smaller, insignificant, as if the war had outgrown them. For the first time, they faced not just an enemy, but inevitability. Sight, the sheer industrial weight of the Allied machine, was not just military reality, it was a psychological verdict on Hitler's empire. Rommel had described his defensive concept in blunt terms. The invasion must be stopped in the water. It must be fought and destroyed before it reaches the shore. But the Atlantic Wall, so often advertised as unbreakable, was not a fortress. It was a mosaic of fortifications linked by hope. Each strong point along the coast was designed to fight independently. Cut off if necessary at Omaha, these positions were labeled when 60 to WN730 clusters of concrete casemates, trenches, and anti-tank obstacles. They were formidable on paper, but limited in range, ammunition, and fields of fire once Allied ships began pounding them. Many bunkers were buried or sealed by collapsing earth. German artillery was outmatched from the first minute. Allied naval gunnery was faster, more accurate, and infinitely better supplied within hours. German batteries at Merville, Point du Hoc, and Longues were silenced or cut off. The Luftwaffe could offer no air support. Only a handful of German aircraft reached the beaches that day. The tactical doctrine of static defense, once seen as efficient, became a death trap. The enemy could choose when and where to strike, and the defenders had no mobility, no reserves, no skies for officers trained in the blitzkrieg. It was a bitter irony. Their own system of warfare had now turned against them. Every gun position that survived the bombardment fought with grim efficiency, but each was isolated, fighting a war that had already moved past them. The Atlantic Wall was no longer a barrier. It was a set of tombs. Armada that crossed the channel represented more than courage. It represented technology weaponized by industrial will. The Allies had perfected amphibious warfare through 2 years of trial, from Dieppe's failure to the landings in Sicily and Italy. By June 1944, they possessed landing craft in every configuration: LCAs, LCTs, LSTs, vessels capable of delivering men, tanks, and artillery directly onto open beaches. Then came innovation on an epic scale: Mulberry harbors, portable docks assembled at sea to sustain supply lines, Hobart's funnies modified British tanks that flailed mines, bridged craters, and cleared obstacles, and a fleet of floating pipelines called Pluto to bring fuel from England to Franceto-German observers. These devices seemed almost alien. Many reported seeing amphibious tanks swimming through surf, bridges materializing on the beaches, and bulldozers pushing aside their own fortifications. The technological contrast was stark. German engineering brilliance had been channeled into weapons of terror and prestige. Weapons. Super tanks, wonder projects. Allied engineering was aimed at efficiency, logistics, and function. Every ship, every vehicle in that armada was a tool of inevitability. The invasion succeeded not because the Allies were invincible in combat, but because they had turned science, production, and coordination into a weapon more powerful than ideology. In the early hours of June 6th, the German command system was still arguing with itself. Rommel's absence meant decisions fell to Rundstedt's headquarters, cautious, bureaucratic, and slow. When reports confirmed mass landings, Rundstedt requested immediate release of armored reserves, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, and Panzerlehr Division. The answer from Führer headquarters was infuriatingly familiar. Not until the situation clarifies that delay sealed the day's outcome. The Germans fought with scattered local reserves, while Allied paratroopers and naval firepower choked every route to the front. Even after Hitler finally authorized the panzers to move, Allied fighter bombers attacked them mercilessly along the roads. Hours were lost, hours that could never be regained strategically. The invasion exposed the fatal rigidity of Hitler's command philosophy. Decisions centralized at the top were no longer timely. They were destructive. The Allied system, by contrast, was decentralized, coordinated, and adaptive. Commanders like Eisenhower and Montgomery operated through shared intelligence, consensus, and flexibility, the antithesis of the German Modell. German officer who watched that armada knew what Berlin refused to admit. The war's outcome would no longer be decided by bravery or tactical brilliance. It would be decided by structure, by systems, and Germany's system was already collapsing. The smoke above the Channel marked not just a battle, but a reckoning. German officer corps had been raised on faith and leadership, the doctrine of the infallible commander, the Führerprinzip. But by 1944, that principle was no longer strength. It was paralysis. In Normandy, leadership broke not through cowardice, but through structure. Rommel, the one man who understood the reality of Allied power, was hundreds of kilometers away when the landings began. Rundstedt, his superior, was constrained by protocol and Hitler's direct orders below them. Divisional commanders waited for authority that would never come. The entire system was engineered for obedience, not initiative. By contrast, the Allied chain of command thrived on trust. Eisenhower's headquarters functioned like a living organism. Feedback, analysis, and rapid adaptation. Field commanders on the beaches could make decisions instantly, adjusting tactics without waiting for London or Washington. The difference was not moral. It was mechanical. One system could move, the other could not. When Hitler was finally awakened around 10 a.m., the invasion was already irreversible, yet he refused to believe the main assault had come. His voice, recorded in later recollections, remained calm but detached. The landing in Normandy is a diversion. The main attack will be at Calais. He ordered most reserves to remain where they were. That single decision ensured that by nightfall, the Allies had secured their foothold from his bunker above the beaches. A German officer could not know every order, but he could see the result. Confusion spreading downward. Courage wasted by indecision. Leadership had become an echo chamber. Brave men trapped by one man's delusionto. The Germans who faced it. The Allied invasion force did not seem human. It was industrial, disciplined, mechanical, and unrelenting. The Allies had refined the art of modern warfare into a system that fused manpower, material, and intelligence into one unified purpose. Before a single landing craft left England, Allied reconnaissance had mapped every meter of coastline. French resistance networks relayed positions of guns and troop movements. Aerial photographs charted tides, Sandbars and beach gradients. Naval gunners had firing tables accurate to the yard for every German battery. The Allies could answer with a dozen guns for every plane Germany could launch. They sent 50 behind the lines. Allied engineers prepared to unload 15,000 tons of supplies per day through prefabricated harbors and floating causeways even as the beaches burned. Bulldozers cleared debris to make way for trucks. To a German observer, this was not just an attack. It was a process. Each hour seemed rehearsed. Waves of troops landed. Cleared paths moved inland, followed by armor and logistics units. The speed of replacement was astonishing. -1 that would have crippled a Wehrmacht regiment were absorbed instantly by Allied reservists. Was the true nature of Allied warfare in 1944. Efficiency elevated to strategy. It was not the boldness of a single general, but the coordination of thousands against such precision. Heroism alone could achieve nothing. The German war machine had been built not only on steel, but on conviction, the unbroken myth of superiority. That morning, the myth died. Officers along the Norman coast had been told for years that the Reich's defenses were impregnable, that the Atlantic Wall would crush any invader. What they saw instead was the full measure of Allied strength, nations united by purpose. Not further. Psychological impact was devastating. Reports from captured German officers later revealed a shared sentiment: disbelief that such a fleet could even exist. The Armada symbolized something deeper: the industrial and moral mobilization of entire democracies against a dictatorship's hubris inside the bunkers. As communications failed and ammunition ran low, morale fractured. Some continued fighting with grim resolve. Others, stunned by the sight of endless landing waves, concluded that resistance was symbolic at best. One officer's diary found near Point du Hoc read simply, "The war cannot be won, the sea has come for us." That sentence captured what thousands felt but could not say. The sight of the Armada was more than defeat. It was revelation. Every promise of Nazi triumph evaporated in that pale morning light. What remained was clarity, the knowledge that Germany's destiny had turned, and no order could reverse it for men trained to obey. That realization was both liberation and despair. The D-Day Armada was not merely a military operation. It was a symbol of transformation in warfare. For centuries, power had been defined by the skill of commanders and the valor of troops, but the Normandy invasion announced a new era where victory belonged to systems, logistics, and production. The German officer watching from the cliffs was witnessing the end of one age and the birth of another. The genius of blitzkrieg maneuver, speed, surprise met its successor, the Allied doctrine of overwhelming force. Sustained by global supply chains and industrial depth, the weapons may have been similar, but the philosophy was new in that sense. His realization that the war was lost was not defeatism, it was clarity. He was standing at the hinge of history, where ideology gave way to economics, where dictatorship met the organized power of free nations. The smoke drifted inland, and the sound of naval guns merged with the drone of aircraft. The officer's understanding crystallized. The Reich could no longer outfight, outproduce, or outlast its enemies. The Armada was proof of that. A floating declaration of inevitability, and that inevitability would now roll ashore, one wave at a time. The officer's realization marked the story's fulcrum, the precise moment when war turned from faith to fact. The next hours would decide whether Germany could still resist or would collapse under the weight of its own designed on June 6, 1944. Normandy. Light rose pale and cold, smeared by gun smoke and mist along the French coast. Watch officers squinted into their periscopes and field glasses, trying to impose order on chaos. At 5:30, the first Allied shells began to fall in sequence, rolling thunder that marched from west to east. The German coastal guns at Long's-sur-Mer replied with deliberate precision, their 150mm shells whistling toward the black silhouettes on the horizon. For a few minutes, the exchange felt almost balanced. Then the horizon exploded in flame. A dozen Allied cruisers shifted their broadsides and answered as one. Each salvo sent shock waves through the cliffs at Point du Hoc. U.S. Rangers watched German tracers rake the sea while their own landing craft pitched through swells higher than a house on shore. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division braced inside their concrete shelters as dust and smoke poured through ventilation shafts. The air smelled of cordite, diesel, and wet chalk at 6:25. Observers on the western flank of Omaha Beach reported an extraordinary sight: endless rows of landing craft moving steadily through the haze. Forming neat columns that converged on the shore behind them loomed the gray hulls of battleships: Texas, Arkansas's Warspite, Rodney, each spitting fire toward the land for the German officer in his bunker. It seemed the channel itself was alive and advancing. Then came the low hum, the sound of thousands of aircraft passing overhead. Bombers dropped curtains of smoke and fragmentation bombs across the rear lines, severing phone wires and isolating command posts. German anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the clouds. Reports flickered in and out. Paratroopers behind us. Beach obstacles destroyed. Communications cut at 6:30. The first wave of American soldiers hit Omaha and Utah. The tide was higher than planned. Many men drowned under the weight of their equipment before reaching the sand for a brief, cruel moment. It looked as if the Germans might hold machine guns at strong points when 6-2 and when 7-1 cut down hundreds in the surf. Smoke drifted low, muffling shouts into distant echoes. Officers called in fire corrections, their range-finders shaking from the concussions inside one bunker near Vierville-sur-Mer. Lieutenant Colonel Gockel's forward observer could no longer see the beach through his scope. He radioed a simple phrase to headquarters: "Der Kanal ist voll von Schiffen." The channel is full of ships. That message summed up the morning. Every horizon line, every mile of sea was crowded with allied steel. The reports spread through the German network like a contagion of disbelief in Le Mans. The 7th Army staff tried to piece together the situation from half-destroyed transmissions. Rundstedt demanded the release of the armored reserve again. The answer from Berlin was silence. By 7 o'clock. British and Canadian troops were landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword. Their naval gunfire was more precise, their coordination tighter. German resistance varied, fierce in places, crumbling in others. At Courseulles, Canadian engineers blasted through seawalls. At Arromanches, Churchill tanks rolled ashore like mechanical beasts, flailing mines and bridging craters. German defenders fought with professionalism, but every destroyed tank was replaced by 3 more at Omaha. The slaughter continued. From his post, Gockel could see figures crawling across open sand. Small and fragile against the gray sea, he ordered his gunners to conserve ammunition. Every shell now counted, but the situation was slipping beyond calculation. Allied destroyers crept dangerously close to shore, firing directly into embrasures at point-blank range. Each hit buried more position. Soundscape became surreal, overlapping waves of artillery, engines, and shouted orders merging into a single continuous roar. Even seasoned veterans felt disoriented. Messages from neighboring sectors stopped coming altogether. The officer stepped outside briefly. The air was thick with dust and salt, his ears ringing on the horizon. The line of ships never ended. At 8 o'clock. The first cracks appeared in the German front. Allied infantry had reached the shingle banks at Omaha and were regrouping under cover of wrecked vehicles. British armor was rolling off the beaches near Gold. Paratroopers were linking up with seaborne units inland, securing exits. The Atlantic Wall, the symbol of Nazi invincibility, was being dismantled in real time. Still, some German positions fought on with remarkable tenacity. At 162, machine gun crews kept firing until their barrels glowed red. At Point du Hoc, gunners aimed their coastal pieces inland, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. They were professionals, fulfilling their oaths even as the logic of battle abandoned them. By 9:30, the reality of defeat began to settle in. Officers scanning the beaches saw Allied engineers already clearing lanes for supplies. Landing craft were returning for second and third waves above them. Allied aircraft patrolled in perfect formation, not one German plane visible. The imbalance was total. Officer lowered his binoculars. Smoke obscured the sea now, But the thunder of engines was constant. He turned to his staff and gave the only order that still made sense: to continue reporting, to document what was happening, so that higher command could no longer deny the truth's last transmission of the morning read. Enemy strength incalculable, beaches lost from view, situation critical and somewhere inland. A phone line crackled with the same message, a coded acknowledgement that the Reich's western wall was collapsing under the weight of history. The invasion was no longer a rumor, no longer a diversion, it was the new reality. Visible from every bunker along the coast, next hours would reveal whether that reality could still be contained, or whether the tide would sweep all of France with it. Normandy coast, mid-morning. June 6, 1944, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of burning oil and salt inland. The once pristine beaches of France had become a living inferno, waves crashing against wreckage, bodies, and steel. Lieutenant Colonel Franz Gockel wiped grime from his eyes and peered through the shattered periscope of his observation slit. He could barely distinguish land from sea now. Everything moved. Everything. Burnett, the radio beside him, hissed with static occasionally. A voice broke through, clipped, urgent, often unfinished. Heavy losses. Holding sector. Need ammunition. Then silence somewhere above the din. Allied aircraft still prowled, strafing the roads and crossroads where German reinforcements tried desperately to reach the coast. At 10 o'clock, reports began filtering in from across the front. The paratroopers, the Phantoms, dropped in the night, had captured bridges at St. Miraglise and Carentan. Columns of American gliders had landed in fields that were supposed to be flooded, scattering men but still achieving their objectives. It was as if every contingency had been anticipated. Every German fallback denied before it begun. Rundstedt's staff, still in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, argued over the meaning of the landings. Some insisted this was the real invasion. Others clung to the belief that it was only a diversion, that the main thrust would come at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler himself was asleep in Berchtesgaden, and no one dared wake him without confirmation. The Armored Reserve, Panzerlehr 12th SS, 21st Panzer, remained frozen by indecision. Every hour of delay gave the Allies another foothold. Meanwhile, on the beaches, chaos was yielding to momentum. At Omaha, scattered American units, remnants of shattered companies, were coalescing into fighting groups under fire. Sergeants and lieutenants improvised new plans. They climbed cliffs, breached wire, and used the enemy's own trenches for cover. The beach that had looked like a slaughterhouse at dawn was slowly turning into a beachhead. German defenders, who had once fired with confidence, now found their firing arcs flanked, their bunkers isolated by grenades and flamethrowers. Sat Gold and Juno, British and Canadian engineers, worked like machines, clearing obstacles while shells still fell around them. The first tanks rolled inland, grinding through hedgerows. Churchill crocodile flame tanks set enemy positions ablaze with terrifying efficiency. German infantry retreated to the next line of defense, not in panic, but in grim acceptance that the fight had changed shape. 11 o'clock. The scale of the Allied operation was undeniable. Coastal observers counted thousands of vessels still waiting offshore. The sea had become an industrial highway, each ship unloading men, trucks, and ammunition in perfect rhythm. In comparison, German logistics looked medieval: horse-drawn wagons, fuel convoys blocked by wrecked bridges, and radio networks shredded by bombing. Inside his bunker, Gockel turned to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Bruntz, and muttered, "It's not an army, it's a factory coming ashore." Bruntz nodded wordlessly, reloading his pistolments later. A near hit from a naval gun smashed part of the ceiling. Concrete dust filled the air. Gockel stumbled to his map table, coughing, his mind racing through reports, every battalion along the line asking for artillery support that no longer existed. The once vaunted Atlantic Wall had become a string of disconnected islands, each surrounded by Allied firepower. At 11:30, a message arrived from the sector commander: hold at all costs, reinforcements approaching. But even the young radio operator, his hands trembling, could hear in the background the dull roar of aircraft and distant explosions. Reinforcements might never arrive at side. German medics dragged the wounded into makeshift shelters. The smell of cordite mixed with seawater was overwhelming through the haze. Allied destroyers inched closer to the shore, brazenly close, firing their guns with surgical precision. Each flash lit the surf like lightning at noon. Gockles stepped outside for a brief moment. The landscape was unrecognizable. The tide had pulled back, revealing twisted metal and the bodies of men who'd tried to storm the beach hours earlier, but behind them, fresh waves were landing, disciplined, relentless, and utterly fearless inland. The first skirmishes with German armor began. The 21st Panzer Division, finally released from its paralysis, attacked between Sword and Juno for a moment. Hope-flickered panzers pushed through scattered British units, even reaching the sea near Lyons-sur-Mer, but the counterattack was too late. Two small Allied naval guns turned and obliterated the spearhead within minutes. From above, Typhoon fighter bombers swooped down, rockets tearing through columns of tanks. What had taken the Germans hours to organize was undone in seconds. By 13 o'clock. Command centers across northern France faced the same conclusion. The invasion was not only unstoppable, it was self-sustaining. Every road, every field, every sky seemed to belong to the Allies. The Germans were fighting not an army, but a system of war unlike anything they had faced before. Industrialized, synchronized, endless. In his notebook, Gockles scribbled a line meant more for himself than for command. We are fighting the future with the weapons of the past. At 14 o'clock. The battle at Omaha turned. U.S. Rangers secured the cliffs. Engineers cleared exits. Tanks began rolling inland through the first breaches for the men still holding German bunkers. The war had inverted. They were now the besieged, not the defenders. One after another, strong points fell silent from the air. Reconnaissance photos showed what no soldier could yet comprehend. 5 beaches, from Utah to Sword, connected by a continuous Allied front. A scar of smoke stretching across 50 miles of coastline. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded in less than 10 horse inside his shattered bunker. Gockles set down the radio receiver. The line had gone dead again through the slit. He could see Allied flags flickering in the wind over the dunes. For a moment, he thought of Berlin, of the high command still debating maps and delaying tactics here. On the ground, there was no delay left to giveth. Officer exhaled slowly, the enormity of the day pressing against his chest. All he could do now was watch as the Allies did what he had once thought impossible: turn the sea into a bridge, the beach into a city, and a single day into the beginning of the NB evening. The beaches of Normandy were no longer battlefields, they were gateways. Smoke still hung over the surf like a shroud, but beneath it the machinery of victory was already in motion. Bulldozers cleared wreckage, medics dragged the wounded to improvised aid stations, and landing craft shuttled ceaselessly between ship and shore. What had begun at dawn as chaos had become an operation of staggering order. The Allies had landed over 156,000 troops by nightfall, along with 20,000 vehicles and thousands of tons of supplies. The miracle wasn't just that they had come ashore, it was that they had done so under fire, on 5 separate beaches, against the most fortified coastline in Europe. From his position near Colville-sur-Mer, Lieutenant Colonel Gockles surveyed the coastline through binoculars captured from a fallen Allied soldier. What he saw stunned him more than the battle itself. The sea was still filled with ships, row upon row, stretching beyond sight. Floating cranes, barges, command ships, repair vessels, a living, moving harbor that had simply appeared where none had existed before. Behind the lines, German units were disintegrating at St. Lay and Caen. Hastily assembled Kampftruppen tried to slow the Allied advance, but they were fighting blind. Allied aircraft ruled the skies. Every daylight movement drew rocket fire. Supply lines shattered. Fuel convoys were obliterated before they could reach the front at Hitler's headquarters in Berchtesgaden. Disbelief had turned to rage. Reports from Normandy were contradictory. Some claimed the invasion had been repelled. Others spoke of entire divisions lost. Hitler demanded the Panzer divisions strike immediately to throw the invaders back into the sea. His generals hesitated. The roads were clogged, communications unreliable, and air superiority completely lost. Rundstedt finally snapped. telling Keitel over the phone, "If you can't make peace, then you must end the war." It was the first open admission by a senior German commander that the strategic situation was beyond salvation. Rommel, returning to the front on June 7th, saw it with his own eyes. He drove past columns of burning vehicles, fields cratered by naval shells, and paratroopers already securing crossroads far inland. How could this have happened? He muttered. The answer was written across every horizon: industrial scale, coordination, and willpower. The Atlantic Wall, once heralded as Hitler's shield, had collapsed in a single day. Out of 15 coastal divisions, most were either annihilated or in full retreat. The Allies had achieved not just a military breach, but a psychological one for the first time. The Wehrmacht had been defeated in a defensive battle it had chosen. On ground it had prepared. That realization spread like shockwaves through the German officer corps in Paris. Senior staff officers spoke in whispers. The word invasion no longer carried the thrill of challenge. It meant inevitability. The only question now was how fast the collapse would come. Meanwhile, in the Allied camp, euphoria mixed with exhaustion. The beaches, though secured, were still under shell fire. German artillery inland targeted the landing zones relentlessly, but the Allied response was methodical. Engineers began constructing Mulberry harbors, artificial ports made of sunken ships and steel caissons. Within 3 days, they were unloading supplies directly onto floating piers. It was a feat no German planner had imagined possible. Command officers aboard HMS Hillary and USS Ancon described the site as a city being built in real time. Rows of trucks rolled down temporary causeways. Fuel lines snaked from tankers offshore to depots on land. It was the triumph of logistics, the invisible weapon of the modern Agape. June 8th. The Allies had secured a continuous front. American forces were pushing toward Corentin, British and Canadian troops toward Bayeux and Caen behind them. The wounded were being evacuated by sea, and reinforcements were already landing for the next phase. Every mile inland was fought for, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had done what every German strategist had deemed impossible since 1940, opened a Western front strong enough to threaten the Reich itself. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht. The realization was crushing. Letters recovered from German positions that week speak not of hatred or fanaticism, but of exhaustion and disbelief. One officer wrote, "The sea is endless, the ships never stop coming, we fight, but it's as if we are striking the tide itself." For Gockel, trapped in the remnants of his coastal battery, the day after D-Day was eerily quiet. The shelling had stopped. The air was filled not with screams, but with the sound of engines, Allied engineers building roads, tanks moving inland, radios crackling with confidence. The German positions that survived were being surrounded one by one. Looked again toward the horizon. The sky was filled with contrails. The sea, still blackened with oil, gleamed beneath the morning sun. The invasion fleet was still there, unbroken, unending. It was not just a military force. It was a manifestation of something larger: industrial will, strategic patience, the belief that tyranny could be dismantled not with words, but with metal, sweat, and sacrifice. For Germany, D-Day was not yet the end, but it was the beginning of the end. Every mile the Allies gained from that beach would carry the war closer to Berlin, and for officers like Gockel, that truth was as inescapable as the tide. In the days that followed June 6, 1944, the myth of German invincibility disintegrated in real time across occupied Europe. Whispers spread faster than any broadcast. The Allies were ashore in France, and they were staying from the Channel Islands to Prague. Resistance networks came alive. Messages in coded verse began flowing through underground channels. French partisans, once cautious, now moved boldly, cutting rail lines and ambushing German convoys. The occupiers' grip, so firm for long years, began to loosen with every Allied advance inland. But within the German command structure, denial still reigned. Berlin continued to issue orders as if the front could somehow be restored. Hitler demanded that Caen and Bayeux be held to the last man. Entire regiments were sacrificed to defend positions already surrounded. Rommel and Rundstedt argued bitterly over strategy, Rommel insisting on withdrawal to regroup, Rundstedt pleading for political realism, Hitler refused both. The consequence was predictable: fragmentation, isolation, and collapsing Normandy. Allied dominance of the air turned the battlefield into a slow-moving catastrophe for the Wehrmacht every daylight hour. Thunderbolts and typhoons prowled the skies. German convoys moved only at night, and even then, few made it through. Supply depots became smoking craters before they could feed a single soldier. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but its few surviving squadrons were outnumbered 10-1 by June 12. The Allies had landed nearly 500,000 men to artificial harbors where operational fuel pipelines ran under the channel. The beaches had become bustling ports, and the hedgerows behind them echoed with the rumble of armor and the rhythm of advance. The Wehrmacht still fought with discipline in the Bocage country. Every hedge became a fortress, every field a killing ground. The Germans fought for weeks to contain the Allied push toward Caen and Saint-Lay, yet each counterattack burned precious reserves that could never be replaced. The panzer divisions, once the pride of Hitler's armies, were being bled white, not in grand maneuvers, but in fields and villages where their tanks could barely move. Rommel watched the attrition unfold with growing despair. He wrote to his wife, "Lucy, the enemy's material superiority is crushing. The war cannot be won anymore. It can only be ended by July." He would be seriously wounded in an air attack, and 3 months later, coerced into suicide after being implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler. The invasion had not only broken the Atlantic Wall, it had cracked the soul of the German officer corps itself. Meanwhile, Allied momentum was accelerating beyond expectation. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July, shattered the German defensive line within weeks. American forces encircled tens of thousands of German troops in the Falaise pocket, annihilating the remnants of the 7th Army by August. Paris was liberated. Victory traced its lineage back to that gray dawn on June 6th, the moment when an officer like Gockel first looked upon the horizon and understood that the war had turned irreversible. Numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Germany had deployed roughly 50 divisions in France. By September, half were destroyed or in full retreat. The Reich had lost not just territory, but time, the one resource it could never reclaim. On the Eastern Front, Soviet offensives surged forward, crushing Army Group Center in Belarus for the first time since 1939. Germany was fighting a two-front war it could not sustain inside the Reich. Morale collapsed. The people who had once cheered victories in Poland and France now whispered of defeat. Cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing trains from the west carried back the wounded. The broken, the truth officer corps, once bound by discipline and pride, began to fracture. Some still swore loyalty to the Führer. Others sought a way to end the slaughter, but there was no longer any strategic maneuver that could alter the outcome. The Allies had returned to Europe not as raiders, but as liberators, and they would not stop until Berlin itself was in ruins. For Gockel and those like him, the aftermath was measured not in days, but in realizations. The once invincible Reich had been reduced to a desperate defensive machine. Even in victory, German soldiers had known limits, but this defeat revealed something deeper: the scale of Allied determination. The fusion of industrial might and moral purposing captured German diaries from the Normandy front. One recurring phrase appears again and again: they had everything: ships, planes, men, courage. We had only orders. By the end of June, the beaches that had once echoed with artillery were humming with engines, cranes, and construction. Allied bases stretched from horizon to horizon: command posts, airfields, field hospitals, and supply depots. The same stretch of coast that had been Hitler's wall was now Eisenhower's bridgehead. Officer who had once stared through the fog at the Armada now stared at his own reflection in a British field hospital window. Captured, bandaged, silent behind his eyes was the same disbelief that haunted many of his generation. They had believed in invincibility, in destiny, in the idea that no enemy could cross the channel. But now they knew the channel had never been the true barrier. The real wall had been built of arrogance. And on June 6, 1944, That wall had finally crumbled when the guns finally fell silent along the Normandy coast. The tide carried more than wreckage back to the sea. It carried away the illusion of German supremacy, and with it, the fear that tyranny could not be undone. D-Day was more than a battle. It was the physical manifestation of an idea that free nations, divided by oceans but united in purpose, could assemble a force powerful enough to reclaim a continent for every soldier who stormed the beach, and for every civilian who waited in silence across occupied Europe. It proved that history could bend, but not break, under the weight of a prescient German officer who once stared at that horizon and saw the end of his world was, in a way, witnessing the beginning of another. Behind the smoke and steel was the rebirth of Europe, fragile, uncertain, but free to breathe again. The invasion was not only a triumph of weapons, but of will, logistics, and imagination. Humanity had turned industry, once used for destruction, into an instrument of liberation in the decades that followed. The beaches of Normandy would fall silent again. Grass would reclaim the trenches. Children would play where men once died, yet beneath that calm lies an eternal echo. The memory of the day the world turned back toward light for the soldiers of both sides. D-Day marked a reckoning for one, the realization that courage and unity could topple an empire for the other, the understanding that blind obedience could not save a collapsing dream. Both lessons remain carved into the sand, resurfacing with every generation that looks back and asks, how did the tide change? The answer still lies in that morning sky of June 6, 1944, gray, cold, and filled with the sound of engines crossing the water. It was there that the modern world began, forged not in conquest, but in the desperate hope that sacrifice could restore peace. And for the officer who watched it all unfold, the truth was undeniable when he saw the D-Day Armada stretch across the horizon. He wasn't just seeing ships, he was watching the future arrive.